Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast for a second time is Ryan Bohl. He's senior Middle East and North Africa analyst at the RAIN Network, the artist formerly known as Stratfor. Thanks, Ryan, for coming on and talking about your piece about Turkey. As I say in the podcast, we have a link to Ryan's piece on the RAIN website in the show notes. If you want access to the Cognitive Investments net assessment of Turkey, that's available only for clients, whether you're asset management or on the research side. So if you're interested in that, email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Otherwise, by the time you listen to this, listeners, I will be somewhere in Portugal drinking port and having a good time. But hope you enjoy the cadence of podcasts we've been putting out so that you can continue to get your geopolitical fix. And I will see you in a couple weeks. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Ryan, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jacob.
So our topic today is one of my favorites, and I think it's a favorite for anybody who is interested in geopolitics, just because Turkey is such an interesting laboratory for geopolitics, especially in a multipolar world, especially in the kind of global macro environment that we have ourselves. It's I remember when I was at Stratfor, like when I was just in the little analyst development program, they would always have the trainees do a net assessment of Spain. Like that was the country that was figured easy enough, but interesting enough to kind of do it together. I think if I was running that program today, I might start with Turkey just because of how interesting it is. You just published The Modern Geopolitics of Turkey on RAIN's website. We should say RAIN now. And we will have a link to it in the show notes and things like that. And I actually just published a sort of similar net assessment internally for CI clients. So if you're a CI client, you've read it. If you want to become a CI client, there's your shameless plug that you should get in touch and do that. But I kind of wanted to start in an interesting place because I agree with almost everything in your assessment, Ryan. But there was one sort of key focal point where I disagreed. I thought we might start the conversation from there, which was you described Turkey's geographic core as Anatolia, and I would fight you and say it's Istanbul, and that is really the center of Ottoman power and Turkish power and like Roman power going back at all. Like all things go back to Constantinople, and if you lose Istanbul or Constantinople, there is no Turkey to talk about, and that you have to go get that strategic depth, and you need the protection that a foothold in Anatolia offers, but that is the real sort of geographic core. So why don't you start with help me understand why you decided Anatolia was not this peripheral part of Turkey, but rather is the core of modern Turkey in its current iteration.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because historically you're right that there's empires typically base themselves out of the Istanbul area. The Bosporus trade is a great place to do your taxes and raid people and other things to make your money, to make your empire. And there's a reason that Byzantium lasted so long there. Geographically, it's a relatively secure place. But I think what we've seen change, and I wouldn't disagree that Istanbul remains a part of the core and remains an imperative to hold that area. But Anatolia's political and social context matters more and more in Turkish behavior. Istanbul literally is European. It's on the European continent. And in a lot of ways, it's more Western-facing, more liberal-facing. Economically, it behaves in a way that I think that European technocrats would rather see Turkey behave. Whereas the Anatolian impulses of this Islamo-nationalist ideology that's kind of emerged from the rural heartland in reaction to, Kemalism, which I would also argue is more of a Western Turkey phenomenon than it is a Central Turkey phenomenon, has kind of shifted where the heartland can be thought of. Within Turkey, because it's not just a geographic setup, it's also a demographic and cultural one. And so what animates Turkish policy, I think right now, the Anatolian heartland is kind of the core driver of what makes this AKP, this Justice and Development government tick.
Yeah, it's definitely, Erdogan's political success is in the fusion of these two areas. I mean, he starts, his political career really starts as a mayor in Istanbul, and he slowly over time sort of links, the interests that are still loyal to him in Istanbul with, the Anatolian heartland. And it starts as a business relationship. And as you're right, it sort of grafts on to this leader of the Muslim world and nationalism. And, it kind of changes over time. But I just kind of wonder how durable that shift is, because when you look at Turkey's modern imperatives, even as you describe them, I was interested in the economic imperative, which was to maintain access to global markets and investment flows, which is not an Anatolian idea. That's an Istanbul idea. And, we're recording here on August 28th. This is going to come out in about a week. Everybody last week was, frothing at the mouth about BRICS. I thought the most interesting thing about BRICS was who wasn't invited to the roster. So Indonesia said, no, thank you. We think we'd like to think about this for a little while longer. You let in Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but Turkey, which is the real economic power of the Middle East, their foreign ministers in Bulgaria talking about how the EU should take accession of Turkey into the bloc a lot more seriously, which I'm not saying that that's going to happen. Probably not going to happen at all. But as the BRICS are talking, Turkey's talking about Europe and is sort of rationalizing its monetary policy and things like that. So I guess the Istanbul impulse is still there, or do you think that Erdogan is just going to keep doing what he's doing, like he's going to be bipolar and ping pong back and forth depending on what he had for breakfast that morning? How do you situate Turkey's economy within this broader viewpoint?
Yeah, and like kind of talking about what you wrote about that Erdogan might not be the most reliable of geopolitical narrators here. I think that our baseline can be that Erdogan, unfortunately, you end up doing a lot of personality analysis with Turkey because of Erdogan's central role in the political system. And so you can only go off of what he's done in the past. And what he has shown himself to do in the past is that he has this greater vision for Turkey. We don't exactly know where it is, but we know that it involves getting it onto a greater position on the world stage. It's supposed to expand as much as it can in the multipolar environment. And whether or not that involves expanding the borders or just having a strong economy or being more Islamo-nationalist, I think he'll get whatever opportunities he can. And the economy is subordinate to that goal. And one of the challenges that he's now got is there are municipal elections currently scheduled next year for March of 2024. That's an opportunity for the opposition to get their game together and maybe get rid of some of their older leadership and then maybe set up the challenge for 2028 again, similar to what they tried to do in 2019. And the economy will be a central role in that. And if Erdogan wants to retake Ankara and particularly Istanbul, like you were saying, Istanbul's economic values definitely influence the country's Turkish, the overall economic strategy. But if he's going to take those posts back and consolidate power permanently for the next generation, he needs to be leaning more towards the technocratic Istanbul economic values if he's going to have his candidates be competitive in that race and not result in the opposition reinvigorating themselves. But I think he'll change his mind over the next, 5 years till the next election? Mm-hmm. Over the next 5 years, someone will write an article, lambasting Erdogan for cutting interest rates in spite of high inflation, because I think that pattern will reemerge when it appears to be a social imperative for Erdogan or a political imperative. The economy is strong enough that allows him to try to push that ideology in spite of the fact that it doesn't seem to work very well on an economic level.
There's an old joke of imagine you're in the 1800s in Poland, and one of these Christian towns is have a job posting, and they want somebody to come blow the bugle every day at 6 a.m. until Jesus Christ returns to the earth. And there first, before anybody else can interview for the job, is an Orthodox Jew who wants the job to do the bugle. And he just does it so beautifully. And, he doesn't have conflicts with the Christian holidays or things like that. So he does his audition. They love it. They hire him. He goes back to his home, and all of his friends, his rabbi, his relatives, they're so confused. It's like, why do you want to go blow this bugle until Jesus Christ returns to the earth? This is sacrilegious. And he said, it's steady living. And I feel that way about waiting for the Turkish opposition to get their house in order. I have waited long enough. I feel like it's steady living to say they're probably not. And maybe that's the moment they're actually going to get it together. But to me, they just had their best chance. And if they're not going to unseat Erdogan right now, he is more threatened by heart attacks to me than he is, or whatever health problems he's having, than anything that the Turkish opposition is going to be able to come up with. So that's probably too flippant, but I don't know. I just don't see it. Do you see any sign that the Turkish opposition is going to be able to fend him off?
I tend to agree with that, because we were writing about some of our scenarios of what the election outcome could be. our baseline was that parliament was most a threat rather than the presidency, but we thought the parliament was competitive, that could have resulted in an opposition-run parliament. We would have had a crisis. And you wrote about that too, about the potential of paralysis and crisis if the opposition took some power back. And that's because we made the assumption that Turks care about the economy the way that Europeans and North Americans do. And that's part of the reason I think the heartland shifted towards Anatolia more than, towards the traditional coastal cities, because not enough Turks view the economy through that lens of, am I better off, my wallet better off 5 years ago, today than it was 5 years ago. Turks on enough of a level to put together a government are willing to vote for somebody that will give them some economic pain, but will give them also nationalist pride and religious pride. And I think that's like one of the bigger trends of our multipolar environment that I think a lot of people in the West are still coming to grips to, is that as countries are trying to assert their great power status or trying to reassert themselves in ways that they haven't for a very long time, they will take the economic hit. They will watch their companies do layoffs, and they'll have a stock market hit. The Russians are the best example, right? They nuked their own economy by invading Ukraine, and yet that did not lead to a revolt against Putin. And he doesn't seem to be facing any substantial domestic opposition because of the economic effects of that war. And that's, I think, the part that where Erdogan has a better thumb on the pulse of Turkey. That Turks will. I remember years ago in 2018, 2019, something like that, after the currency crisis, my colleague and I, the Middle East North Africa analyst, she was saying, I've talked to these people in Istanbul, and they say if the dollar goes past 7 against the lira, 7 lira to the dollar, that's crisis point. That's the end of Erdogan. That'll collapse. And this is an Istanbul person. And we kept trying to peg down what's the number that breaks Turks' support for Erdogan. And the answer is there is no number. It's a qualitative, not a quantitative support that they've got for him. And the quality that they seem to be looking for is someone that makes them be proud to be a Turk, who doesn't lose wars, picks very smart wars to fight and very short wars to fight, and who occasionally bashes the West, even as they buy arms from them, and keeps ties with the Russians, even as they're supplying TB2s to the Ukrainians. That seems to be where your 50% plus one a number of Turks who turn out to vote, that's what they want to see. And I think we're still coming to grips that's how people can behave on an electoral level.
Yeah, there's a couple things I'd say with that. First, I sympathize with you 100% on the Turkish lira thing, because I remember trying to square that circle as well, and it just doesn't work. I haven't looked at it in the last week, but we're approaching 28 on the dollar, so we've gone from 7 to 28. And Erdogan, not only is he doing well, like everything is going fine. And it's funny, Max Weber described charisma. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, because I don't have Max Weber quotes just lodged in my head. But his point about political charisma was that people who have political charisma have the ability to make you vote against your own self-interest or believe in something that is against your own self-interest. The greatest example of this for me was when Donald Trump was out there railing on the campaign trail about Obamacare. And then you start interviewing people on the ground, and they're like, yeah, we all hate Obamacare. And then you ask them, well, where do you get your health care? Oh, I get it through the market exchange. Well, that's Obamacare. And they're like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I know what my health care is. Like he managed that bait and switch, and he had the charisma to do it. And Erdogan is a very, very charismatic individual. One of the reasons I had some suspicion that he wasn't going to do so well in this election was because he got sick right at that stretch run, right where his strengths are most powerful. And to his credit, he managed to get through whatever that stomach bug was and push through and do his kind of master campaigning. We spoke a lot about Israel the last time you were on the podcast, and there is something similar here, I think, in the sense that the Israeli electorate, 15 or 20%, I forget the exact number, is Arab, and not even the left is going to partner with Arabs in government. I think the Bennett government sort of did. I wouldn't even call it real cooperation. That was really the first time in Israel's history that happened. Turkey has the same thing going on, because you've got the Kurdish segment of the population that is sort of toxic to especially nationalist parts of the Turkish electorate. And if you're just going to hive off 15, 20% of the electorate, it just makes it that much harder for a center left or for a non-nationalist sort of approach to succeed. And I wonder if that is also something that is happening with Turkey in general, and which we're going to see and maybe in some of these multi-ethnic states, even as we are sort of live in a more nationalist world. I don't know. Do you agree with that, or would you qualify any of that?
Well, I think that's what's so interesting about studying Turkey is that nationalism it's not like we can tend to think of nationalism as a right-wing thing and then left-wing thing. In Turkey, nationalism is both a government and an opposition thing. There's a very large nationalist party, the EE party, that's split off from the ultra-nationalist MHP party, whose acronym I always have to Google what their acronym is. But basically, the MHP are these descendants of a group called the Grey Wolves, who are ultra-nationalists. One of them may have been involved with trying to shoot the Pope back in the 80s. They're far right. They founded their own party, and then they split. And they split over loyalty to Erdogan. And their ideology is fundamentally the same. They still see Turkey as a nationalist, revanchist power where the Kurds don't have a place. And that makes it really hard for the opposition to put together a coalition with the Kurds. And right now, I think tomorrow, the Kurds are going to be rebranding their main party, the HDP, to another left-wing party in order to see if they can overcome this problem, if they can change their labels, if they can get those ultra-nationalists in the opposition to join with them. But it makes it really very difficult because as countries think about themselves in more nationalist and self-interested terms, your ethnic minorities are absolutely going to be scapegoated and suppressed kind of across the board. And it gives, particularly in systems like Turkey, where it's coalition-based, and imagine if the United States was coalition-based, how interesting our politics would be with all of our subsets. As a result, it allows these marginal parties or these smaller partners to really drive national policy in a direction where maybe 75% of the country wouldn't want to go that way, but that 75% is divided amongst themselves, and the decisive kingmaker is a national group. So, yeah, I think you're onto something. That's becoming more and more normal. Some systems are better at mitigating it than others. Turkey is not very good at mitigating it. It gets pulled by those extremes based on the structure of its political system.
It's when you said that the HDP was when the Turkish Kurds are trying to rebrand themselves, I had this image of them like walking into Mad Men office and going to Don Draper and being like, hey, so we're really hard up and we need you to rebrand Kurds so that we can actually have some political rights. I'd love to see what Don Draper could do with that one. But jokes aside, why don't we step back a little bit, because I wanted to pick up on something else that you wrote in your piece, and also that we've already kind of touched on a little bit. You talk about how Turkish power is ascendant in multipolar time periods, and I think that's true. And I think it's also specifically true in times when Russia is weak, because Russia really is that, the thing that blocks Turkey. And you can have other powers. I mean, for a couple centuries there, Iran/Persia was the balancer, but that was in the Middle East. When you think about the totality of Turkish power, if you have a strong Russia, it's going to be very hard for Turkey to have independence and do the things it wants to do. And that's why you get the Crimean War and World War I. Like all of it sort of goes back down to that. And I think one of the things that has been frustrating for the West has been Erdogan's pragmatism towards Russia. They've obviously had their problems. There was that, the Turks shot down a Russian fighter jet a couple of years ago in Syria. Maybe that was going to be the thing, but it never seems to break. And I guess my question to you is, do you think it's going to break? Because I've been getting all these whispers from people saying, oh, well, actually, Turkey and Russia are finally starting to butt heads. Turkey didn't want the Black Sea Grain Initiative left. It was sort of a diplomatic star on Erdogan's chest to say, oh, I did all these things, but then Russia left. The renegotiations haven't gone well. It's still sitting out there. It's not there. Turkey's not a member of BRICS, apparently. They're going to start talking about the EU and things like that. Do you think, for me, the moment at which Turkey really moves from sort of middle power to ascendant middle power is when they say, okay, Russia, like, we're not just going to be nice to you. We have some interests too. We're going to push back against you the same way we push back against the Europeans and the Americans. Do you think we are anywhere close to that? Or do you think that Erdogan is still sort of, we are not strong enough yet economically, militarily to pick a fight with Russia? We really need to be on a lot stronger footing before we go after that one.
Right. And I think you can think of it in the way that Turkey's approaching Russia is kind of like chipping away at the edges of Russian geopolitical influence in the areas that Turkey cares about. Best example is that Turkey backed a relatively successful war in the Caucasus. They backed Azerbaijan against Russia's ally Armenia, and Russia didn't lift a finger against that. And in fact, we're still seeing the Azeris look like they might, informally or formally take more territory from a Russian ally. And suddenly the Americans are involved in the Caucasus diplomatically, while the Russian peacekeepers are nowhere to be seen. So that's kind of an example of how I think Erdogan and Turkey will approach Russia, is finding these weak spots in which there are conflicting interests and seeing what they can erode away without taking too much risk. Because when we look at how they behaved in the Azerbaijan war, they were providing drones. They did send some F-16s apparently, but they didn't see any real combat. So they never really crossed that line where they might have ended up in a Russian air defense system's crosshairs. But they did it with such adroit geopolitical deftness, where they were able to take risks where the worst that might have happened is they lose a drone, which they've done with Syria before, and things like that. And that's not the first place that Turkey and Russia have faced off. They faced off in Syria multiple times, of course. Idlib in 2020 as well, in northwestern Syria, and Turkey lost territory, but it destroyed a lot of Russian equipment, kind of presaging how we'd see the Russian military behave in Ukraine, that some of their air defenses weren't as good as was seen on paper. And then also that year, 2020, Turkey's drones went up against the Wagner group in Libya in their intervention there, and again came out mostly on top. But Turkey's able to do this without being maximalist. They don't look for complete victory. They look for very 19th century partial victories. You're talking about the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean War. That war certainly wasn't about the conquest and total domination of one side or another. It's about limited objectives within the Black Sea and about the great power status of the Ottoman Empire and trying to shore them up. And that's how Turkey is behaving. And I think in the retrospect, when we write the history of the 21st century, and maybe you and I will be old enough to be able to do that at some point, there will be a moment where we're like, aha, that is where Turkey kind of overcame the dam of Russian geopolitical power, because it'll be a slow tide that goes up and up and up. And then at one point, we'll see something decisive. And I think that's what Turkey will continue to do, because there's also notable constraints. Rostom, the Russian energy giant, they just started a nuclear power plant inside of Turkey, and they need Russian uranium to keep that thing running. And the US and EU are not in a position to replace that program. And the Turks are still reliant on Russian energy. They're reliant on Russian food imports. So with those constraints in place, not only does Turkey not have an interest in being maximalist against them, but they also have an interest in finding areas of cooperation to keep those areas, those places going. But I think if they can get lucky, and I think the place to watch really is Syria, will there be a moment where Russian military power has been eroded so much that there really isn't a Russian military in Syria anymore, and then Turkey is able to push back against the Syrians and the Iranians? I think that would be most likely to be your moment where you say, you know what, Russia's no longer a check on Turkish ambitions or imperatives anymore. Now Russia is a partner or even a junior partner in that relationship.
Well, and to your point, I mean, Turkey, yes, dependent on Russia for food. Also, Turkish government supporting Turkish farmers, trying to get them to grow more crops locally. Yes, dependent on Russian energy, but Black Sea gas deposits and, Mediterranean pipelines. They're also in Libya. They're also like running around Africa. They don't get as much publicity as everybody else, but they're there too, probably working for resources. But I take your point. It's probably a little bit too early there. But sort of keeping on that same... I don't know that I want to go straight to China, but I think the way I'll frame this is, NATO, Turkey is a NATO member and is a NATO member for now. Before the Russia-Ukraine war and before a lot of the things that happened with the pandemic, well, I think it was maybe after the pandemic. I'm getting my chronology a little bit mixed up, but you probably remember that, France and Turkey are on opposite sides in Libya, and there was this incident in the Mediterranean where the French were trying to send a ship into Libya, and Turkish ships locked on to a French frigate in the Mediterranean because they said, hey, you can't send that stuff here. We had an agreement that you're not allowed to come into this sort of thing. And there was this brief moment where everybody was like, is NATO dead? Are Turkey and France about to shoot it out in the Mediterranean? And NATO has never really decided to go in as a bloc to defend another country, to actually make use of the military alliance. It's more the threat of the military alliance than anything else. But it seems like some of Turkey's commitments via NATO are not going to gel with their interests from a geopolitical perspective. So the flippant question is to ask you, do you think that Turkey is in NATO in 10 years' time? But why don't you riff a little bit on sort of how you see Turkey's relationship with NATO in the context of Turkey's geopolitics?
Well, it sucks to be a NATO policymaker, I think, in regards to Turkey. There is no formal mechanism to eject a member from NATO. Nobody's really sure how that would work. It might be a full, unanimity, a membership majority. It's not clear. So how would you eject them? Well, who knows? But the other thing is that Turkey's role in NATO made a huge amount of sense when the Soviet Union was trying to overthrow the Turkish government through PKK, etc. There was an imperative there. That imperative went away. But NATO's been reinvigorated by the war in Ukraine, which threatens the Poles and the Baltics and all of these other new NATO members. It doesn't threaten Turkey directly. Even if we assume somehow the Russians take over all of Ukraine, it take over Belarus, and even steamroll Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Turkey itself can live with that situation from a strategic standpoint, so long as their energy and other connections are continuing. It's not the same imperative as it is for mainland Europe, and that I think creates that distending of the way that Turkey behaves. And Erdogan and the AKP government are very aware they can violate Greek airspace without causing a war and get their boosts in the polls, and they can target NATO warships and do drilling in NATO waters in Greece and off the coast of Cyprus, and they can violate those without over-escalating. What they've never done, again, is never taken that maximalist approach where they totally blockade Libya from other NATO partners, or where they drill in a place where Greek frigates show up and try to get them out and there's a shooting incident. They've never gone to that level, in part because they know that the blowback of that would be severe economically, could involve in sanctions, and of course, in an actual shooting war, they might not do terribly well. They have no interest in moving in that direction. So I think that what you'll see over the next 10 years is the Turkish role in NATO will frustrate everybody in the West from time to time, like it has with Sweden and Finland and their demands that they've been making from there. But at the same time, Turkey will continue to cooperate with that alliance so long as that alliance has overlaps with what they're looking for. Biggest thing is Turkey wants to have defense independence, but they also want American F-16s. And American F-16s have to have maintenance. They have to have equipment. They have to have you in the NATO alliance if you're going to keep those up and running. And as long as that exists, until Turkey has its own replacement for all of these systems, it'll continue to drift. It'll continue to stay within the NATO umbrella, utilizing it as a free rider. You know, the way that, somebody who doesn't pay taxes gets free police protection, so to speak. That's how Turkey will behave with NATO overall, without necessarily, the only thing I think to consider is what are the conditions under which Turkey might leave the alliance? Mm-hmm. And that I think might be more salient because a member exiting the alliance, as we saw with the French in the 60s, is much more viable than it is for the alliance to kick them out. So under what circumstances might Turkey decide they don't need the alliance anymore? That I think is something that might be worth exploring.
Well, to me, that raises China because you're right. Like NATO's having this mission creep where it was a military alliance designed to constrain the Soviets. The Soviets are not there anymore. Russia is a nice stand-in, but Russia's not the Soviet Union. But when you look at what NATO's been doing in the last couple of months, it's clear that there is an effort to not welcome countries like Japan into the alliance by any means. They probably wouldn't get in, but to forge better relations with countries like Japan and like South Korea. And a lot of these stalwarts, especially the European stalwarts in the United States, it goes without saying, are thinking about how to contain China in the long term. And it seems to me that China is a very difficult issue for Erdogan because maybe not so difficult. It just shows the sort of bankruptcy of ideology, because you can talk about leader of the Muslim world all you want, but how is the leader of the Muslim world cooperating with a country that is doing what China is doing in Xinjiang? And to me, that creates cognitive dissonance, but it has created no cognitive dissonance whatsoever in the Turkey-China relationship. You would also think maybe Turkey and China are competitors in Central Asia. I sort of think of Turkey thinking of Central Asia as in its big geopolitical sphere of influence, and China certainly seems to be making its own moves there as Russian power recedes. But so talk to me about the scenarios that you could see Turkey leaving the alliance. Is it China or is it something else entirely?
Well, I think there's probably two broad scenarios. One would be China. Like China takes BRICS and turns it into not just an economic, kind of loose economic alliance striving for de-dollarization, et cetera, but actually either BRICS or SCO or something brand new, which is literally the equivalent of a Chinese-led NATO. If that emerged and China became very assertive in the Middle East, where it's guaranteeing the security of Iran, guaranteeing the security of Saudi Arabia and of Iraq, and balancing all these powers, if it's replacing American power the way that America replaced British power and French power after World War II, that's where I see Ankara being very interested in a military, a formal alliance with China, or at the very least exiting the NATO umbrella. On the other hand, you could see something like an alternative regional alliance emerge that's more of a security guarantor between, say, Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and even Israel could be involved in this in the normalization accords. And maybe they're all focused on the Iranians. Maybe they're all focused on the West. Maybe they're all just trying to keep each other's backs because the multipolar environment is so unstable that they know that the age of the U.S. riding to the rescue is over and they can only look to themselves That's where you could have an alternative alliance emerge. And maybe Turkey still keeps the NATO label, but it removes itself from the command structure, it ejects the American base, and it's basically a vestige at that point. So you could have a regional alliance kind of develop over the next 10 years. That's got a lot of constraints. You could also have a China alliance develop over the next 10 years. But again, a lot of constraints. I tend to think that those are still less likely than Turkey hanging on in NATO and annoying everyone. But I think those are possibilities, and they could be in reaction to future geopolitical shocks that we can't see, a new pandemic, another great financial crisis, huge instability in the United States to the point where its foreign commitments are in doubt. Anything like that, those kinds of shocks make those less likely scenarios a bit more likely.
And how much emphasis do you put on Erdogan for thinking about these scenarios? So like if we say that Erdogan's not going to be in power in 10 years and it's just going to be somebody else, does that all hold, or do you think that Erdogan is really the one holding the keys here for Turkey's posture in that short term?
I think in terms of who is the adroit politician, is Erdogan. That matters on the tactical level. I think on the strategic level, regardless of who you have, even if it was Kılıçdaroğlu, you'd still have Turkey's drift in a different direction away from the West. Their imperatives are just shifting slowly over time. But Kılıçdaroğlu might have been more pro-Western. He might have, but I bet their monetary policy would probably be pretty similar right now. We can't even tell the difference right now between if the opposition won and versus lost. But I think that there would still be those imperatives that would be dragging Turkey into an independent direction. And that independence is complicated in the multipolar world. It was complicated in the 19th century as well. You'll never figure out who the hell the alliances were back in that era. So as a result, if Erdogan goes in 2028, and I think this is an interesting question, is whether or not Erdogan decides to leave based on his constitutional limits. Who takes over? How do they adjust their perception of the imperatives? What sort of political social structure do they rely on? And where does that naturally drift the political system, the economic system, and even their overall strategy? And I don't think we have an answer to that question yet. We don't know if Erdogan is going to leave peacefully in 2028 or change the constitution or find a successor or become Putin and just grab power. We don't know yet.
I think if he's healthy, he'll be around. I think he's not going to go down until he decides that he's had enough, or that his health precludes him from doing so. But sort of the last big ticket thing I wanted to hit before we let you go is, and you kind of already alluded to it, I felt pretty good about Turkish monetary policy and the direction after the election, and that didn't matter if it was going to be the opposition or it was going to be Erdogan, it was going to flip. And that was really easy to predict just because Turkey was out of money. Like they were hard up against it. And none of the things that Turkey has done economically in the last couple months work if the Gulf doesn't bail them out. And Erdogan seemed to have a line to the Gulf, and he goes there and he's hanging out in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia and things like that. And the money has been forthcoming. Talk to me about that, because does the Gulf actually think that they're going to be able to control Turkey just because they sent Erdogan some checks? That seems like a strategically short-sighted move. Is Erdogan going to continue to just sort of like ping pong all over the place with monetary policy because he thinks he has a blank check from the Gulf? I mean, that would be very short-sighted for a politician as skilled and as perceptive as he has been. I don't quite get the sudden sort of, Turkey is not going to be the dominant power in the Middle East. It's going to accept all this money from the Gulf and be dependent on the Gulf money.
Well, we can go back a little bit into what caused the split between the Saudis and the Emiratis and Turkey, which was the Arab Spring, and the Muslim Brotherhood, which Turkey backed. Muslim Brotherhood as a regional movement is dead. They've got a few local chapters left. Erdogan acknowledges that ideological project is halas, as they would say, completely finished. So, and the same with Qatar's soft power strategy used to be a threat to the Saudis and the Emiratis back when it was backing regime changes and Islamists coming to power. Now Qatar has no options for that. So that kind of removes one of the friction points, which could resurrect because the social contract in the Middle East is still broken. The political systems aren't terribly responsive, and it could still resurrect. But so long as it's not there, that improves areas for cooperation, and it's very transactional. The Turks, they've got their TB2 Bayraktar drones that have done excellent battlefield performance, all things considered, in Ukraine and Libya and Syria, et cetera. The Saudis and the Emiratis want such systems. They want to buy arms from NATO partners so that they can use them in places like Yemen or Iran or wherever without U.S. sanctions coming down the pipe, because buying from a NATO partner is sanctions proof. The U.S. can't object to that. So there's a military component where Turkey can provide military know-how for the defense drives in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and that's very transactional. At the same time, the Saudis and the Emiratis are looking for defense or for investment locations where there's not necessarily the same kind of sanctions risk that there is in the US or in the European Union. There's not the potential of suddenly a decoupling like there is in China or within Russia. No one expects Turkey to launch an invasion of Europe that results in them being cut off from the international system. So it's a relatively safe investment destination. And they are looking for returns. They're doing strategic investments in which it's not just purely a bailout, although they've done some money for the central bank, and that's probably more geared towards earning concessions in the defense sector. So you've got these powers that are working together for now because it's a mutual benefit to them both. And that's where that scenario of could Turkey ever leave NATO? Well, if this trend continues, it could culminate in defense upgrades to the point where you do see an indigenous military alliance starting to emerge between these powers. And we saw, of course, Turkey sent troops to Qatar to protect them. That was kind of almost them acting like a preemptive NATO right there. But I'm sure that Turkey would love nothing more than to lead up some kind of military alliance like that. And those are the longer term trends, I think, is that they don't have anything dividing them exactly like there were 10 years ago. And they've got enough opportunities that they can gain from one another. But absolutely, if some other driver of instability emerges in the region, if Islamism starts to resurge, Turkey will naturally end up being a backer of that. Saudi and the Emiratis will naturally oppose it, and we'll return to an adversarial relationship there.
And where does Iran fit in?
Right. And so that's where the Saudis and the Emiratis don't like their American partners right now because their American partners are retrenching and have a lot of opinions about their domestic politics. And they don't trust them to watch their back against the Iranians. So that threat helps drive them towards that defense ties towards a place like Turkey that has systems that could at least allow viable retaliation against the Iranians should they ever pull an Abqaiq ever again, right? Or the attack on the Aramco facilities in 2019. At the same time, Turkey has no interest in taking their side in that the confrontation with the Iranians. And so the Turks are looking to be partners and not necessarily direct allies. And they're trying to create this almost a tripartite kind of balance of power within the region where the Gulf Arab states have the economic heft and some of the extra regional power backing from places like the US and some defense ties to retaliate, balancing against the Iranians' proxy strategy, which is balanced against the Turks' conventional military. And you've almost got like a three-way system kind of all leaning at each other, except that it's still developing, it's still unstable, and it's still possible that they slip past one another when their interests kind of collide. Turkey and the Iranians still at loggerheads in Syria, but now apparently as of today, the Turks are going to cooperate with the Iranians to crush the Kurds in Iraq a little bit. There's all of these little transactional and compartmentalized relationships, but all of them are seeking security. The Iranians are still seeking a regional dominance posture without necessarily taking over their neighbors. They want to influence their neighbors politically and socially and religiously without having to send in full-scale armies. The Turks and the Gulf Arabs are trying to defend against that and push against that as their traditional great power guarantor, the United States, is exiting the region and not as interested in fighting, maximalist wars as they used to be in the past.
I'll get you out of here on this. The sort of end of your piece talks about how the internal contradictions of Turkey that we've talked about here, however, it appears, however unlikely, it could produce a crisis that is too great for the modern Turkish state to balance. And this contradiction carries with it a low long-term risk of serious destabilization in Turkey that could begin another cycle of collapse, consolidation, and alignment. Define for me what low long-term risk is. Give me a percentage or give me something to benchmark what your scenario looks like there, and what flip side, what do you think is the more likely scenario for Turkey as we go forward here for the rest of the decade?
Well, you could think of it as like maybe 5 to 10% right around there over the next decade. And what collapse in the Turkish context today would look like, as we were talking about before, is like the Kurds, an independent Kurdistan emerging. You could have also the fractionalization or the factionalism of the remainder of Turkey to the point where places like Istanbul and Izmir are essentially city-states or independent. They might still retain the same flag, but there's no longer a centralized Turkish structure to hold them together. And you could also have lots of people fleeing Turkey, and which collapse looks more like an economic one where there's still a Turkey rump state, but it's functioning very poorly and doesn't have a lot of innovation. And that would be the result of Turkish mistakes, I tend to think, that it would be Turkish overreach that would provoke that. NATO is not going to push for an independent Kurdistan, and that's probably the only entity geopolitically that could push for an independent Kurdistan and get away with it, unless Turkey does something absolutely unfathomably offensive to NATO. Turkish troops with Russian forces, the Turkish Navy in the Taiwan Straits, helping invade Taiwan. It would have to be a substantial alignment change for NATO to push that. That being said, there's instability in the trajectory where Turkey will have these options of picking sides. And if Erdogan himself is still in charge, or if it's a successor and a puppet or whoever is an ultranationalist, and they make those mistakes, that's where Turkey could once more kind of provoke the one group that could actually cause its dissolution. I tend to think that that's not as likely. I think that Turkey will muddle through, but personalities change. Erdogan could get too old and too kind of nationalist in his final years, where he decides to take gambles like annexing northern Cyprus that result in substantial pushback from the West to the point where the Kurds feel emboldened. And there's also the chance that the Kurds get better at politics and get into the West's political bloodstream deeply enough that a combination of Turkish mistakes and Western sympathy results in their independent state becoming more and more likely. But I tend, again, the baseline scenario is that Turkey muddles through, and they get really close to the fire without actually melting the candle, so to speak. And it's frustrating to see them make what seems to be the same mistake over and over again. But there is a deftness to it, where they always somehow manage to get that frying pan out of the fires, if that's enough metaphors for you.
It's enough metaphors for me. Ryan, thanks so much for the time, and look forward to having you back on. It's always great to have you, man.
Thanks so much, Jacob.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.